The Treasury's been developing the LSF over some years to recognise that many of the problems that we face in our economy and in our society in New Zealand are increasingly complex. If you consider climate change or environmental degradation, the problem of pollution in fresh water, the changes in the work environment that we face because of new technology and things like that, inequality and social disconnection. These are issues that are really complex and multifaceted. The LSF tries to incorporate all of these different factors about what makes for a good life into the thinking about what governments can do to promote an environment where citizens in New Zealand and businesses and households and whānau and families can flourish and can do the best that they can to maximise their own well-being. So the framework is divided up into current well-being and future well-being. In current well-being, we have things that represent all the different facets of things that enable people to live a flourishing life. So whether it's income, housing, safety and security, education, health, these are all examples of the different dimensions of current well-being. And then in future well-being, we have the concept of four capitals, which are the foundations of future well-being. They're the things that enable us as a society to promote our own well-being, whether it's through land and buildings and factories and physical capital, or through human capital, which is the knowledge and skills that we have, whether it's through our health, and of course the natural environment and the way we interact with each other in our communities and in our social environment. We have lots of existing data about the capitals and the different domains of well-being. They're measured at different frequencies and in different ways. So we bring all of these things together and try to do the best we can with the measures that we have at the moment, as well as doing work on the things that we would like to measure, would like to measure better. We need to make some improvements in the way we measure things. So on it, roughly, most of the measures are done annually, some of them are done quarterly or more frequently, some of them are done much less frequently, and that is really a question of what is the best way to measure these things and what's going to be most useful for the analysis. New Zealand routinely appears very high in the ranks of places to live in the world. We have high living standards in that sense. We are usually, New Zealand is celebrated for its clean air, its abundance of natural resources, and its generally easygoing and friendly social relations that you can enjoy when you come to New Zealand. That's not to say that there aren't issues that we have to deal with. There are instances, as everyone knows, of pressure on the environment, of areas of environmental degradation that we need to clean up. There are issues of child poverty and homelessness. There are issues of mental health and other sort of troubling issues of our time. So I don't think we should ever be complacent about the things that we need to improve in New Zealand. But having said that, we should also recognise that there are many areas of strength in New Zealand as well. And so that is what the Living Standards Framework hopes to, that is what we hope to illuminate with the Living Standards Framework, is those areas where we're doing relatively well, those areas where we're doing not so well, and therefore what we need to improve. The LSF dashboard is, if you like, the measurement framework that sits underneath the Living Standards Framework. So the Living Standards Framework at a high level is a set of concepts and a set of relationships among these concepts. And that's very important to us because it enables us to define what we mean conceptually by human capital or natural capital or social capital and so on, some of these more relatively abstract things. And you need to do that before you can take on the job of measuring what it is that you think living standards is about. So first you have to define what living standards are, and then say, well, what do we have, and what can we measure to shed light on how things are doing in reality, if you like, in practice. So the dashboard is the measurement counterpart. It is incomplete at the moment. We are not measuring everything that we would want to measure, and so we're doing work to expand the dashboard and what it's able to tell us about how things are tracking, if you like, with the different concepts that are in the living standards framework. So the indicators in the dashboard have been deliberately chosen to be quite slow moving, meaning that that reflects that they are focused on the performance of New Zealand as a whole. So those things that make living standards in New Zealand good or bad in an enduring sense over the years. So for example, things like healthy life expectancy, things like the cleanliness of air overall, things like whether or not people have trust in government institutions like the police. These are things that don't move very much from month to month, or quarter to quarter, or even year to year, but that, in a sense, is not the main focus of the living standards framework. The main focus is to be able to create a way of assessing how we are doing as a country over relatively long periods of time. I'm often asked whether the living standards framework means that the Treasury has abandoned GDP. I think in some sense it's an oversimplified question. We would never abandon GDP. GDP is a very important framework for understanding the size of the economy, and that's in turn very important for understanding things like the tax base that governments have available. It's very important for budgeting purposes. It's very important for understanding economic dynamics, macroeconomic dynamics around unemployment and inflation and so on. So all of those aspects of our work as the Treasury haven't really changed. The Living Standards Framework is not intended to replace those at all. What it is there to do is to enrich the analysis that we do with the other aspects of well-being that governments typically consider. The LSF, the dashboard, is very focused on showing things that are related to each other, and that enables us to consider as analysts where the trade-offs in public policy are and where the synergies are as well, so that when we produce advice for governments to make certain decisions, that advice can include the complexity of the trade-offs involved, whether it's trade-offs between the environment and economic development, which is a pretty traditional trade-off that people think of, or it could be trade-offs between certain social impacts of policy versus economic impacts, and so on. There are lots of areas also where certain interventions can have positive impacts on more than one area of interest, and so those are the sorts of things that we'll be looking to use the framework to bring to the surface and to help our analysis and our advice for business. One very good example where the where the framework was used to illustrate the trade-offs and dependencies between different policy areas was in the case of the regeneration of Eastern Pororua. This is a business case that's recently been approved by the government. It is a large-scale redevelopment of housing and other amenities in a particular region, and as part of that work we very explicitly used the framework to consider all the different health, education, safety and security, employment and so on aspects of the redevelopment and the different impacts that it would have. And some of these impacts across the different options that were considered for the regeneration had impacts on lots of different aspects of well-being, and other options had impacts on other sets of well-being dimensions. And that's an example where, by considering all those different dimensions within a coherent framework, we have a better ability to provide rich advice about the merits of different options. Eastern Pororua included a traditional business case, and of course business cases always have to include a financial and economic aspect. It's the tradition they've grown out of, very rightly. So what the Living Standards Framework has done is augment that basic foundational business case concept with these other aspects of well-being that governments typically want to think about when they're thinking about investment proposals such as pro rata. For this budget, for the wellbeing budget this year, government agencies were required to use the concepts in the LSF to explain the basis on which they were making budget bids and the benefits, the net benefits that they saw that would arise from their budget initiatives. And so we were able to use the framework to compare initiatives with each other and to provide advice to the government on the package of initiatives that would have best impact on the priorities that the government set for the wellbeing budget. So the government set wellbeing priorities. There's 5 of them that you can go and read on in the budget policy statement, and these priorities were themselves developed from looking at the dashboard data and other information sources to determine what the government wanted to focus on for this budget. The LSF has been developed by economists, and so there are no free lunches in the LSF, and so it is very much the case that it is not only about the trade-offs between dimensions in the current time, whether it's between spending on health outcomes or spending on education outcomes or spending on defence outcomes or those sorts of things, but it's also about intergenerational trade-offs because if we spend today and have to tax or raise debt to fund that spending, that means that somebody else is having to fund those taxes, or somebody else in the future is going to have to pay off that debt. So there are these inescapable choices that as a Treasury and as economists we always feel an obligation and duty to point out to people that there are no such things as free lunches, and what the framework does is allow us to talk about the cost of lunch and the cost of this lunch versus that lunch. The distributional aspects of well-being, that is to say how income or education or health outcomes or safety outcomes are distributed across the population, is a relatively new part of the framework, and it's a response to the observation that in certain aspects of life inequality is increasing, and that this is a concern to people, and it is also a concern to economic performance and social performance. And so what we're trying to do with the framework is enable us to use the data and shed light on the way in which inequalities are playing out in society, whether it's between men and women, or between young and old, or between different ethnic groups, or between just the concentration, if you like, of wealth and income across different groups. How much richer is the top 10% versus the bottom 10% of society. You can see how these things move now, and we have data on those things, and so it's really important for us to be able to bring that into our analysis and be able to bring evidence to bear on these questions of fairness, distribution and equity that governments are charged with managing on behalf of society. Risk and resilience are another part of the framework which we are making explicit because you never know what's going to happen in the future. Bad things and good things can happen. You don't know exactly when and in what form, but you have to be prepared as a society and as an economy. So the concept of risk and resilience is to help us get our minds around the way in which we as a society and an economy can respond to these adverse events or these opportunities that arise, whether it's natural disasters or technological change. The area of risk and resilience is about how we can adapt and change in response to these things, and whether or not those adaptations and those responses serve to improve our living standards, or whether or not we have some vulnerability that needs to be addressed somehow. The Living Standards Framework is focused on vulnerabilities in New Zealand first and foremost, but having said that, many of the if you like, adverse shocks or threats to well-being in New Zealand do come from offshore, whether they are, global economic events or, increasing terrorism risks and things like that. These are things we need to be resilient to, and there are measures that we can take in society and by governments to improve the way that we can respond to those and adapt to those, and get back to life as normal, or life is better than normal, hopefully, when these sorts of events happen. The Treasury's overriding goal with the framework is that we are able to use the framework alongside the other tools that we have to make sure that we do the best we can to support governments in making decisions that they believe are in the best interests of New Zealanders, both current generations and future generations. So we don't have specific goals ourselves for living standards of New Zealanders, other than that they should be increased over time. But it is up to the governments of the day, and it is up to elected politicians to make the trade-offs and make the value judgments that they need to in our system in order to deliver their interpretation of what voters have asked them to do. The dashboard will be updated over time. We will always keep it under review as to whether it's doing the best job it can in illuminating our advice and supporting our advice processes. One very important development in connection with the dashboard is the publication of the Indicators Aotearoa New Zealand framework by Statistics New Zealand quite recently. And that's an initiative which seeks to support wellbeing measurement across the public sector, including the dashboard, the Treasury's dashboard. And so over the next little while, we'll be working with Statistics New Zealand to see how we can integrate the dashboard and Indicators Aotearoa New Zealand so that they tell a coherent picture of wellbeing across the different things that we're measuring with those two tools. They have different purposes, but many of the indicators are similar, and so we have to go and do the work to make sure that they are as coherent as possible. There are lots of aspects of the LSF and of the dashboard where the measurement should be improved, and this will take time to do, of course, but we already have some idea of where we could make those improvements. Natural capital is one example, where the ecosystem and the biosphere is a very complicated thing, and we're still learning about what it is that makes it tick, and therefore this will be an ongoing work program for many of us to understand that better and incorporate it better in the Living Standards framework. The measurement of aspects of children's wellbeing as well is an area we'll be looking to improve as a system, working with others in the system. And then finally, in New Zealand, of course, the Māori perspective, or the Tao Māori perspective on wellbeing is very important, and that's an area which we will be looking to develop over time and in consultation with experts in the field. This is a development program of many years, we expect. We have been working on the Living Standards framework for some years, for a decade or two, but we recognise that there's still lots to do. There's lots we don't understand about living standards. There's lots that can still be developed around both the conceptual work of what underpins living standards over time and what's important to living standards, as well as the measurement and the empirical work about what really makes a difference to living standards and what governments and others can do to promote living standards. So the program will carry on, we very much hope and expect for many years to come. When interpreting the Living Standards framework data and what's in the dashboard, everyone, including Treasury analysts, have to be very careful to understand the limitations of what we're doing. That is not to say that there isn't information value, it is just to say that the interpretations are always open to discussion and debate. That is a natural part of what we do as analysts. So the best we can do, the least we can do, of course, is to be transparent about the basis of debate, about the evidence that is relevant to a particular question at hand, and to put all that out there so that we can have a reasoned discussion rather than a discussion in which people talk past each other. So some aspects of the framework are better settled than others. Some are at the boundaries of what we know about how things work, and at the boundaries of what policy analysts typically think about. This is why it's an ongoing process of development and an ongoing process of discovery. Some of the indicators in the Living Standards Framework are difficult to define. There is disagreement still about what exactly one means, for example, by justice and equity. If you ask different people, they will come up with different definitions, and to some extent these are value-laden judgments, and so resolving those disagreements and arriving at a consensus view of what we mean by some of those dimensions is a first step. And then after that step we need to address the measurement question of, well, okay, if that's what we mean by justice, then how do you measure whether or not New Zealand is doing well on justice or not? And these are highly spirited academic debates and debates held by researchers as well as other interested parties on the question of justice, which of course is a very important question. So it's a highly emotive debate sometimes. This is the environment we're dealing with, and it's on us. Our part of it is to try to work through that in a way that is most helpful for the governments that we advise. Before settling on this latest version of the dashboard, the first version of the dashboard, the Treasury did a lot of consultation with many different groups. We deliberately tried to be as diverse as possible and to cover all the different parts of the spectrum of views on this topic of living standards. And we suspected this would be the case, and it very much was the case, that there are lots of different perspectives out there. And so we wanted to hear them all and take them all into account to the extent that we could. So we spoke to academics, we spoke to counterparts overseas treasuries. We had a challenge group which comprised representatives of different sectors of society. We spoke to Māori groups, Pacifica groups. We spoke to representatives of the Asian perspective on well-being. As many as we could think of. We did a web survey for the public to provide comments online, as well as running focus groups and different ways of collecting perspectives on what well-being and living standards means to people. So we think we ran a pretty thorough process of gathering views. We then had a pretty large job of boiling it down and saying, well, what is the way of capturing all these diverse views in a way that's most useful to governments and to the public and to Treasury analysts in this work. That consultation process also revealed that there is more to be done in certain aspects where there is disagreement, where there are things that aren't resolved, where there is still gaps in our knowledge that we need to fill, and that is informing our work program on this as we go forward. When you do a consultation, you always learn things that you didn't expect, and that happened very much in this case as well. And so we made changes to what we originally planned. We incorporated different areas of richness into the framework and some new indicators, some different indicators on the basis of our consultations. One example of an area where we thought quite a bit harder about how we would represent this aspect of well-being in the dashboard was around the well-being of children. And it's the case that, the well-being of children is of course very important to intergenerational well-being, almost by definition. And it became pretty clear in the consultation that, through the consultation process, that there is work to be done on measuring the well-being of children and understanding how the well-being of children in connection with the well-being of their families works together. And so this, the latest version of the dashboard, the first version of the dashboard, if you like, has lots of variables that are interesting in terms of the household conditions in which children are living, and we are also have in the dashboard the ability to present the well-being of households with family, households with children versus households that don't have children. And you see some interesting patterns there. That's one of the things that we paid quite a lot of attention to as a result of the consultation and the perspectives that people were offering, emphasising how important the well-being of children is to New Zealand. I think the most useful thing that the LSF has done, or that I would want to see coming out of the LSF work, is that it should improve the conversations we have as analysts and as members of the public and as citizens about what makes for a good life in New Zealand. So with the dashboard, we hope that by putting out numbers and specifics on the question of well-being and living standards, we can improve those conversations, and we can bring the wealth of evidence in the different areas together in one place and have a much richer and more coherent discussion as a society about how we can improve well-being and what matters most to New Zealanders as they go about their lives and as they think about what they want for their families and for their futures. This is something that has been difficult to do in the past because there are lots of indicators about lots of different things, and so what our Living Standards Framework tries to do is bring it all within a coherent framework for considering this question of well-being and advising governments on that question. When we did the consultation on the Living Standards Framework and the dashboard, we had a range of views, and some of them, to be honest, were negative. We did get quite a bit of challenge from some orders about why the Treasury should be interested in aspects of well-being beyond incomes and beyond the traditional areas of Treasury focus, which is fiscal performance and economic performance. And I think the answer to that is that we are, of course, still interested in economic performance and fiscal performance. That is our core role. That is to provide advice to governments on how to improve economic performance and to improve fiscal performance. But the Living Standards Framework recognises that that is actually a means to an end. The economy is there to improve people's lives. And with some of these complex problems that we're facing as a society around climate change, adaptation and mitigation, around technological disruption, about changes to the nature of work and so on, these are issues which don't necessarily lend themselves to the same solutions or the same approaches that we had in the past around improving economic performance. We need to improve economic performance in arguably a different way, to take account of somewhat different things now than we used to in the past. And so we've tried to emphasise in this work, partly in response to that challenge and that criticism, that this is about doing better economics. This is not about not doing economics and not doing fiscal analysis. It is about being much more explicit about the ways in which economic dynamics play out for well-being. And sometimes they're not positive, and we need to be taking account of that in the way we do policy work. We've also had challenge that and we expected this in the consultation, that we had many different suggestions about the different areas of focus that we should have in our Living Standards Framework. That if we had taken on board every suggestion for an indicator in the framework, we probably would have ended up with 500 indicators, because understandably everyone probably in society has a different focus on what matters. So we've tried to be as balanced and comprehensive as possible with the dashboard and with the Living Standards Framework, while keeping the whole thing manageable and keeping it coherent. And that has been a challenge analytically. We will continue to test whether we are doing the best we can with balance and comprehensiveness, and that will involve more discussion over time with different experts and different parties. We've had a lot of interest from the public in various forms, both just general members of the public and charities, philanthropic groups, other non-government organisations, civil society, in what we're trying to do with the Living Standards Framework, because there's a lot of commonality in the goals that we've set out for the Living Standards Framework and the goals that people have for their own lives. They want to have greater well-being for themselves and for their children and for their families. And so we have had a lot of interest and offers to help and offers to engage and discuss the issues with us, which is terrific. We're very welcoming of that. It's tempting to see the valuation of capitals as one of the goals of the Living Standards Framework, but that's actually not. It's not a goal in itself. We tend to use. We look to use monetisation and valuation as ways of understanding how the different capitals work and how important they are to each other. But in some cases, valuation is either not possible, monetisation is either not possible, or it doesn't actually add very much to the analysis or help us with our decision making. So the fundamental question for us is, in the development of the Living Standards Framework, is what is going to help us make better decisions and what is going to help ministers make better decisions. In some cases, monetisation can help. There are now techniques where you can put values on things, which enables you to compare things, in a common currency, which is useful analytically. But in some areas, that's not possible, and it probably won't ever be possible if we're talking about rights, or if we're talking about justice, or some of these more, if you like, absolutes about life and what makes it worth living. Those are things that we probably wouldn't. I would find it hard to see how we would ever be able to put a useful monetisation framework around those things. One of the great benefits of the dashboard presentation of the data we've collected is that it has made clear what the relationships are between many of these aspects of well-being that we often talk about casually, and that most of us probably have a suspicion go together, but it's really useful to be able to see the data on that documents that fact, and then from there to be able to understand why it's the case that these things go together. So for example, housing, most people would understand intuitively that warm and dry housing is important for education outcomes, for health outcomes, for labour market outcomes, and so on, employment, income, etc. That these things go together. But the value of the dashboard, in our view, is that by collecting together the most important and salient indicators and data on those different dimensions in one place, it enables us as analysts to do the research work on why it is that these things go together. Is it because when you have high income you're able to buy a warm and dry house? That's probably part of it. Or is it because having a warm and dry house gives you the security to be able to support stable employment? Now, the reality is probably that it's both, but it's really important for policy analysis to be able to tease out those different mechanisms and understand what it is about that connection between those two things, in that example, that is most important. And that, in turn, gives you a clue as to what it is that governments and others should do to maximise the benefits of warm and dry housing for employment, in that example. And have a look at the heat maps of the associations between different dimensions of well-being, and also the presentation of the multi-dimensional aspects of well-being for particular groups. The dashboard enables you to do lots of different data visualizations and presentations of the data, so that you can see these different associations and think about them and what they mean, and ask the question, why is that association there? What might be causing it? What might we do to make use of that association when we're developing policy initiatives or other sorts of activities? It's always been a tradition in the Treasury to be very transparent about what we do. In fact, a tradition in New Zealand, in the New Zealand public sector, we have a very strong international reputation for transparency and public integrity. And so the publication of the dashboard is consistent with that. We would like to think that the public will find it useful and researchers will find it useful to be able to have access to the same data and set up in the same way that our own analysts have, because we welcome contestable advice, we welcome alternative points of view, and so putting the dashboard out there is part of encouraging that public debate around living standards and what will improve living standards for New Zealanders. The Living Standards Framework and its dashboard are a tool primarily for the Treasury to use in its own advice processes, but part of the publication of the dashboard and its release to other parties is to encourage and support the work we do with other agencies. We've been pretty happy with the response from other agencies to the release of the dashboard and the Living Standards Framework, because I think as a public sector we are all striving to focus on the outcomes for New Zealanders of our work and of the advice that we provide to governments. So yes, other agencies are very interested in using the framework. We welcome that, of course, and we work with them to make sure that to the extent we can, we are developing a tool set that will be useful for lots of different agencies, as well as the Treasury. We know from talking to overseas counterparts that there is a lot of interest in the New Zealand approach to measuring wellbeing and producing advice on wellbeing. We've had interest from many jurisdictions offshore, the Scottish Government, for example, the OECD actually, which is a collection of about 35, 37 developed economies, has a very strong interest in wellbeing analysis, and we've worked closely with them, and they have been very interested in our progress as one of their members in trying to implement this work in our policy processes. So this is very encouraging. It is also it makes us pretty aware that lots of the rest of the world is watching us and trying to learn from what we're doing in New Zealand, which is a great thing.